Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Talking with Tarashuk podcast. I shaved a beard, but not the hair. That's probably coming next week. But my name is Will Tarashuk. T as in Thomas, A-R-A-S-H-U-K. A lot of fun last week doing some unnamed nonsense, asking random questions, getting silly answers. But today, I am joined by Dr. Adrian McIntyre, who is a cultural anthropologist, international speaker, and storytelling consultant. He has worked in over 30 countries, given hundreds of live media interviews, so maybe I'm number 1,000, delivered 1,500 on-stage presentations, so maybe not, and written 2 speeches that were presented to members of the UN Security Council. So that's very interesting. Today, Adrian advises and trains entrepreneurs like myself, small business owners like myself, and corporate teams on communication, business storytelling, personal branding, media, and presentation skills. I'm sure I could use 1 or 2 of those. His clients have ranged from solopreneurs, freelance professionals in aerospace companies, hedge funds, technology startups, United Nations agencies, and global nonprofits. Adrian, my man, welcome to the podcast. That's a great intro you wrote about yourself that I could just read off there.
Yeah, no, we should thank my mother. I'm sure my mom had something to do with that at some point. No,
I mean,
it's great.
It's hard writing intros about yourself. I tried to do it myself, and it's terrible. It's terrible.
It's ridiculous. Hard. It's literally, and I used to, one of my earliest little business ventures after graduate school was I started advising people who wanted to go to graduate school. Yeah. Before I realized that my best advice to them is in most cases don't go to graduate school. So I stopped doing that. But that's a genre, writing those essays about yourself, whether it's for college or grad school or fellowship or literally anything else. It's an exercise in a really weird form of writing because you, both the author and the subject, and you're creating this character on the page, and it's a really strange and dislocating thing. So thank you, I guess.
Of course.
None of that stuff is actually what defines me. It's just things I've done. But there you go.
Exactly. It's your resume. Now, are you famous enough where if you put your name in the ChatGPT, it'll actually tell you something about yourself? Have you tried it?
Apparently not.
Oh,
I have tried it. I'm not famous enough for it to have an answer, and I'm probably vain enough to have tried.
I feel like everyone's vain enough. I was like, hey, who's Will Tarashuk? And it just goes, I don't know.
I mean, listen, I remember in the late 90s when I was convincing everybody that they should be switching their search engine from Ask Jeeves to Google, and they're like, what is Google? And I'm like, you should put your name in there and see. And people were literally so freaked out, this is like 97, 98, by what this thing knew about them. ChatGPT is not like that. It doesn't even try to be like that, but there you go.
All right. So, Adrian, introduce yourself. Anything I missed, fill in the blanks for me. I know I had you write about yourself. I had your mom write about yourself. So, introduce yourself in your own words or in the own words of your mother, whatever makes you comfortable.
Right. Well, actually, my mother's words are not the words I would usually choose. So there's that. But no, I often introduce myself. You're a professional gathering or a networking event. Just this last week, I was at a big gathering of startups and investors here in Phoenix. And people often say, so what do you do? And as a pattern interrupt, and also because I don't want to have a boring conversation, I will say I'm a cultural anthropologist. And that was the first thing that you said as well. And that doesn't define my profession, but it does shape how I see the world. It's a toolkit that I've been trained in that shapes the way I think about who I am, who you are, who we are, and what this human thing is all about. So at some level, it is the right answer, even though it's the wrong one, because nobody ever really knows what that means. And, sometimes they're like, oh, what's that? And sometimes they're like, huh, okay. And that's the end of the conversation. But that's, that's data, that's feedback. So cultural anthropology, for those who don't know, is a weird social science. And why weird is that it started out as a very amateurish thing that was uncomfortably attached to empire. So most anthropologists were from Europe or North America, and they were doing what later they called research. But at the time, it might have been other things, like including colonial administration jobs, working in faraway places where people were really different, and asking questions like, how do these people put their lives together? What is significant and important to them? What sorts of myths and rituals do they practice? And what forms of social structure do they have in their culture? And culture for anthropologists started off being a noun, this thing that people had. So you had the Trobriand island culture, and you had, the Samoan culture, all these other kinds of things. Over the century or so that anthropology really became a professional and academic undertaking, some of the certainty about that got knocked loose a little bit. And we began to ask more interesting questions like, well, what if cultures aren't discrete things that you find on the ground like rocks, right? What if we're not doing biology, which primary, role is to identify new types and fit them into some like system of Linnaean classification, right? What if there's something more interesting and more troubling about being humans, studying humanity through the lens of the human sciences? There's this weird kind of circular thing there. And that might sound like nonsense and babble to people, but at some level it makes you ask really interesting questions about who we are, about the stories we tell ourselves and each other, about what it means to be human. And there you have it.
Well, I had a friend of mine, very, very smart man, tell me, like, culture is literally just what groups of people do. Like, that is what culture is. It's like, I'm Italian, so Christmas that we do 7 fishes, or I'm Polish, so we eat a certain food. That's just culture, right? Culture is this, what a group of people do. Like, this gaming culture. People like to game on Discord and this, that, and the other. So culture is really just a study of what people do and how they exchange ideas.
Right. At some level, that's not wrong. And it's also not exactly right. But what's cool about that definition is it makes you ask yourself a question. Well, even if that were true, if culture is what people do, then what tools are appropriate to the study of that object? I mean, one of the fascinating things about the human sciences, well, the natural sciences as well, is that every new major advance started with some innovation in technology, and specifically like instrumentation. So, before people invented the microscope, Hans van Leeuwenhoek or whatever, I probably butchered that, but so historians of science don't hate me. It's been a long time since I read that stuff. But some guy invented, ground glass to make lenses and put them together in a particular way and made a microscope. And now all of a sudden we could see things that we couldn't see before. And it's like, oh, maybe there are these invisible organisms that are alive, and maybe that's what's making you sick. Maybe it's not just the witch doctor or, something else. So every new advance in the instrumentation that allows us to see differently has been followed by a fairly revolutionary change in what we think we're looking at. And I think at some level that's also true for humanity. In fact, I wrote something, you mentioned ChatGPT, and I wrote something about AI the other day. And I basically said, I think the greatest threat that AI poses to humans is not what we've been talking about. It's not that it's going to, somehow the robots are going to kill us. It's not threatening our lives. It's not even threatening our livelihoods because we're adaptable and, trucks didn't put horses out of business completely. I think it's a threat to, and I'm okay with this, by the way, I think it's a threat to who we think we are. See, regardless of any of those scientific revolutions that I just alluded to, we've persisted in this idea that humans are unique and special and have this kind of place of utmost significance in the grand scheme of things. And I just don't think that's true. But most of us haven't been willing to go there. So I think, and I won't get into the whole rant about it, but basically what I was saying was ChatGPT or, these large language models' ability to perform these linguistic feats that just blow us away is going to be more troubling because we thought that we were the only ones that could do that. We thought we were the only ones with language and consciousness. And, really all that is stringing together words in particular ways to tell stories about ourselves. Right. So now that an algorithm can do that, we're like, oh my God, maybe we're not that special.
It is a bit of a threat, but it's as a point to us being special. I mean, can you really blame people thinking we're special? I mean, planet Earth, as far as we know, in the solar system and the galaxies, we are the only being that can communicate like this. Dolphins have the way of communicating, but not to the extent that we do. We are a very special and unique animal on this planet. So, yeah, even though, yes, AI can do these things, it is created by people still.
Right.
But, I mean, we are special because we are, like, what compares to us, the way we do it and the way we are intelligent and communicate on the planet?
So the short answer is we couldn't possibly know because we're trapped inside our paradigm. So we don't know. But to your first question, do I blame people? No, I don't actually blame people for anything. Honestly, my moral philosophy is really like, as far as we know, we are one species amongst many, but all human beings are members of a single species. So, and we don't live like that. We don't act like that. We don't take care of each other like that. But given that we are, in fact, one species on this rock spinning through space in the middle of nowhere, could we please just not be assholes to each other? Like, is that too much to ask?
It is. It is. Unfortunately, it is.
Okay, well,
I don't know
I guess
why,
I should lower
but
my
it is.
expectations. Fair enough.
Well, it comes to, again, with anthropology, it comes to the clash of society and culture. Now, you mentioned like that the technology's changing culture. I would say the technology's changed society more. Like the invention of the wheel, did that really change culture? Did it change society? Or are those terms interchangeable?
So those terms are both trapped in a 19th century paradigm for viewing, the objects of analysis. And I think there are things certainly that are appropriately labeled within the realm of the social and other things in the realm of the cultural. And at some level, it doesn't, I'm not an academic anymore by choice. And so, I just don't worry about splitting hairs about stuff. But different sciences define their object in specific ways in the 19th century. So sociology said, we're the people who are the experts in society, and anthropology said, we're the experts in culture. And linguistics in its early days defined language in a very particular way, such that the new science of linguistics was the appropriate science to study this object. So it's just games of knowledge, games of truth, and it's all fine. It's not worth getting hung up over unless you're, somebody said once about elite academic life that the infighting was so severe because the stakes were so small. So, if you got three people in the ivory tower who get themselves worked up over these things, I think the rest of us shouldn't worry too much.
I agree. I think generally we're going to be okay. I mean, some people aren't going to be okay as time goes on, but that's, survival of the fittest has always been a thing. It's not going to stop now because we have technology. But with society and culture, does cultural appropriation drive you crazy? Or is that something you're like, no, I get that?
Well, it's not always right. And so there's that. And I get it, which doesn't make it okay. I mean, again, understanding what's happening. Like, I feel like, take this in a slightly different direction just for the point of clarification. Like, trauma is real. And some of that trauma is the result of horrible things that were done to people by other people. And so to say, for example, now this is an extreme case, to say, look, I can understand and somewhat appreciate the complexity of the abuser's situation. They were also hurt. They were hurt by people who were hurt by people who were hurt by people. None of that makes what they're doing okay. Like, so you can kind of hold the two together without reconciling them. And it's easier, of course, the more distance you have from the thing.
Right.
So cultural appropriation doesn't bother me in the same way as it would bother someone with less privilege and power whose culture is being appropriated, right? So, but I can still say, hey, you know what? I don't think that's cool. I think we should actually have a conversation about why we assume that some of these things are quote unquote free for the taking. Like, why that's not yours. Like, right. Where'd you get that? That's not you.
Well, isn't culture,
without at the same time, because real quick, the flip side of that is also untenable to me, which is the kind of, liberal hand-wringing about some of this stuff. We could get silly in any different direction on the spectrum. So trying to be pragmatic and trying to have a conversation, I think we all need to have a set of adult conversations about what it takes to do better, right? We can all do better, like all of us, so we can have those conversations. So no, it doesn't drive me crazy. And I don't think it's right. I'm trying to give a nuanced answer as possible. But you were about to say something, Will.
I mean, two things can also be true at the same time, right? It can be a complicated issue. But I think where people kind of lose sight and can't see the forest through the trees is the idea of intent, right? Because culture is meant to be shared, especially in America. We're a melting pot. I live in New York. I live next to New York City. There's more cultures here than around the rest of the world combined, probably.
Some of which can melt. Some of which can melt. And others of which can't. So that's an interesting conversation to have there. Even in the 20th century history of immigration, there were groups, including the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews, that were the object of racist attacks, who then over time became white, or at least white enough.
Yes.
And so, the melting pot ideology is not a multicultural one. it is a monomyth kind of ideology. Like, well, and it leaves out the people who can't melt. And, so there's that. But
okay, interesting. Where was I going to go with that? Because intent. I'm going back to intent. Because intent
that's
matters.
right. Yeah.
Intent matters. Now, there is. I'm not going to say cultural appropriation isn't real, because there is definitely ways you can mock other people's cultures in a way that is harmful, in the ways, like you said, power structure and all that thing. But there's plenty of ways it's just like good old-fashioned fun as well. Like, for example, if I want to have, I don't want to use me as an example, but if someone wanted to have a themed wedding, right? Like they want a mariachi band because they generally love Bad Bunny and generally love Spanish. Like, I generally love Spanish music. I listen to Spanish music all the time, but it's because I'm white. I can't have like a live performance of a mariachi band at my wedding. I don't plan on doing that, but I can't do that based on the laws of cultural appropriation. That's just, it's like appropriation can also mean appreciation.
Sure. And the reality is there are no laws. So
right.
there
also
are, and this is where it comes back to power relations. So I think intent is good, and that's the right word to bring to the forefront. And along with intent, I think you have to pair it with a word that sounds similar but is different, and that's like intention and intentionality. So some people are very thoughtful and intentional, and they're going to approach something like you talked about, like what music you want to have at your wedding, right? There's no law. You should have whatever music you want to have. And if you're thoughtful and intentional, there may be a series of conversations that you want to have with yourselves, with, the other people in the wedding party, with et cetera, and come up with something that, takes into account the fact that there are historical inequalities in power relations and things of that nature. Now, you might do that. I think the thing that people are most troubled by is the fact that the lack of any thoughtfulness or intent and the assumption that, well, I can do this because it is funny, right? It only gets to be funny from a position of unexamined privilege. And that's the thing that's rubbing people the wrong way. It's like, don't you even realize that without any sort of thought or care, like you're able to, right? You're able to like, oh, this is just a joke, right? The fact that you can even say that means you're not appreciating the full significance of what's going on. Is any of this simple? No, I don't think so. Do I think that the extreme right and the extreme left both get goofy on this topic? Of course I do. But do I think there's something really valuable in the middle where we actually ought to be questioning ourselves probably more than we are? Yeah, I do. Because honestly, being more thoughtful, being more engaged, being more appreciative, this brings us back to what I hope is going to be a through line through this conversation, which is I really think we ought to be talking more, not less.
Absolutely.
With each other and with people who are different from us. And rather than starting from the premise of, hey, this is going to be okay, right? It might be interesting to ask the question rather than try to have the answer already. So I think people should talk more. I think we should get more uncomfortable. I think we should, I tell my kids, I've got two boys, 8 and 11, I try not to believe everything I think.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they get that yet, but like we're trying to at least introduce this idea that, listen, you can have opinions just like everybody else. You can have thoughts, but don't confuse those thoughts for reality.
Right.
Check them out.
Exactly.
Talk to people. Investigate.
And sometimes you have to take the position of something you don't even believe in. Right? Just for the sake of argumentation.
I don't think that, but go ahead. Tell me what you're thinking.
Well, it's just like I don't like to think of like I am right, you are wrong. Right? Or this issue is the right issue, this issue is the wrong issue. It's more of like an understanding, right? I want to understand your perspective. I don't need to agree with you. I need to understand you. So if I'm speaking with someone about gun violence and they're saying, hey, man, this is my Second Amendment right, like no one's going to tell me how I can defend myself based on a principle. That's a principle. Now, I might not necessarily agree with that, but I will make that argument with somebody who is arguing with strong gun legislation. It's like, hey, I don't necessarily agree with this point, but this is a point that needs to be heard and understood because that is what someone I might disagree with, who you might disagree with, is thinking, and they have a voice in this too. Like
sure,
something like that. So it's
right.
Like,
so here's
please go
what
ahead.
I would just add to that is just a slight little twist, and this will be me, not you, so I'm not going to put words in your mouth. But for me, it's less about taking a position in order to have the conversation and more about asking the questions in order to have a conversation. So, and I think that's the key is like, are we having an inquiry and a discussion or are we having a debate? In a debate, there's supposed to be two sides that sort of take, their best shot at each other and then try to rebut and whatever. And that's great when a debate is what's called for, right? And I find in most situations with most people outside the context of, a high school or college debate team environment, or, the silliness that we've now put on national cable news on all the channels where, you line up these guests to basically scream at each other because that's going to drive more ratings and, eyeballs,
we're
etc.
We're going to get to the current state of journalism.
Yeah, exactly, which is not good. It's really not good. So for ordinary folks like you and I and everyone else listening to this, I think the thing that would drive a lot more interesting conversations is curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Like actually getting really interested and curious and trying to understand. And at some level, this is what the anthropologist would say. Try to understand it from their point of view. Try to get into their shoes. Try to see how it looks over there.
Perspective.
Without judgment. Now, at the end of the day, I reserve the right to judge people as mercilessly as everybody else. I'm not saying this is all about being a softie and like, it's all fine. It's not fine. There's a lot of things that are not okay.
Right.
But in engaging with people, I'm not going to make that premise that I'm right, you're wrong, the frame of the conversation.
No, and it's understanding the biases. Now, people like to say media needs to be less biased. Well, yes and no, right? Media is very biased because people are biased. At the end of the day, media is just made up of people. Everyone has their biases. It's better if you recognize and understand your biases.
Yeah. And there's one here that I think throws people for a loop, but I am of the strongly held and well-considered point of view that so-called objectivity is a bias.
Yes.
And media, so traditional journalism was done in an environment that was dominated by white people on a handful of networks that were controlled by rich people. Some of this has changed, some of it hasn't. And so what passed for objectivity was a kind of both sides approach. Like, well, let's hear equally from this side and equally from that side, and then we're neutral and we will sort of rise above the fray. I do believe that a journalistic code of ethics that has a reporter, committed to the truth has a place. Although, as a practice, that's somewhat in the decline. It still holds as like an ideal, but I don't think a lot of people have the budget to do that because fact-finding costs money. I love what Roy Woods Jr. said just recently at the White House Correspondents Association dinner, where it's like, say what you will about a conspiracy theory, at least it's affordable, right? That's such a great point.
That's
because
pretty good.
Finding facts costs a news organization a lot of money. There's a lot of people
who have
to be
lying.
paid.
Look at Fox
lying
News.
Is free.
Look at them.
Yeah,
the My Pillow guy
could cost
$5 million
$900
for his lies, right?
$900 million is a lot of money. That's an expensive
even though
lie.
half it's going to pass off to the taxpayer, but hey.
The insurance company. But anyway, my point here is that form of objectivity was always only an idealized version of things. And it foreclosed the questions like, well, wait a minute, what stories and angles don't even get considered as options for coverage, right? So maybe you're going to try to tell this story fairly and accurately. Good. Fairness and accuracy are important. Accuracy probably more than fairness, to be perfectly honest. But in any case, what about all the things that don't get considered? What about the layers that a story has to get filtered past before it's even going to make it to the news? I mean, think about all the things that were going down that were really important and were not newsworthy in the eyes of the newsmakers. And then you'll see what I mean. So,
no, I know exactly what you mean. They showed.
I don't think that objectivity should be put on a pedestal. I think that's a mistake. That locks us into the same thing has happened in science over the years, and then there have been philosophers who have brought this into question. But the basic idea that we can only ever have partial knowledge. Our knowledge is always positioned in a field of power relations, and we need to understand that. We can't claim that somehow we can remove. We're human. It was to your point, Will. We're people, and people have blind spots. The scientists who have rigorously identified and cataloged all of these cognitive biases still have them. Right? Just knowing about it doesn't make it go away. So
do you think we should bring back the fairness doctrine for media? You don't?
No, but I do think that we should. Well, because for one thing, so for years, and I don't want to dwell on this.
People don't know. Explain what the Fairness Doctrine was.
The Fairness Doctrine was official policy of the Federal Communications Commission that you had to give equal time in broadcasting to members of both political parties. So it's very much mapped onto a system in which there's two official points of view, and the way to quote unquote be neutral is to just simply give them equal amounts of airtime. So no, I think that's a too coarse and flat-footed of a doctrine. At the same time, I don't think that actually having, most of what we do now is not even covered by the Federal Communications Commission because it's not broadcast on airwaves owned by the government or licensed from the government. So
it's on the internet.
Yeah. So, but more important than the Fairness Doctrine ought to be the revealing our biases doctrine. In other words, every one of us ought to be examining to a certain, to whatever degree necessary, so that if someone were to ask, well, what's your bias, they could actually answer the question without embarrassment, because we all have them, but we're trying to pretend we don't. So that's the problem. So, and for years, what's happening is the convergence of the old-fashioned media that was still holding to accuracy and truth and whatever, and new forms of performance on cable initially, and then on and the airwaves, because a lot of this stuff started in the 90s with Rush Limbaugh and his cronies. So a lot of this stuff then had the exact same appearance as the sort of older quote-unquote objective way of doing things, right? So it had the same sound, the same look, the same chyrons at the bottom of the screen, the same little ticker, the same thing with the breaking news. And now we just have a mishmash where opinions and reporting and, the circus are all sharing the same platform and look exactly the same way. And I don't think, I think what we have in this country fundamentally, if I was going to get on my little soapbox here, is, we have people whose business models rely on the rest of us being ignorant to the ways we're being played. I think fundamentally that's what it comes down to. So those business models are more effective when they can make us emotional, right? Anger and fear and outrage are good for business. And I don't care which end of the political spectrum I'm talking, it's all of them, right? Keep people scared, keep them angry, keep them afraid, and you will keep them watching. You will keep them subscribing. You will keep them donating, etc. So the problem is we have a government by the people for the people, but the people are the last ones to know what's really going on and have the weakest set of resources provided to them to become educated citizens, right? So, and that works for the elites of all kinds who prefer that the rest of us are angry and dumb because it fits.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're
their purposes.
We're the last person to know, but do we know? Do we know the truth? Are they telling us the truth? It's so hard to trust.
Well, whoever they is, I guarantee you they are never telling us the
right.
truth.
They're not telling us the truth, but
some of them, they aren't telling themselves the truth either. There's this wonderful book written years and years ago about a totally different thing, but it asked this profound question: did the Greeks believe their myths? Right? And I won't get into the details of it and everything else, but
it's a great question.
We sort of take it for granted. They're like, well, of course, there was Zeus and there was a thing.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Did the Greeks believe their myths?
Right? Literally, or they take messages and meanings away from it. It's you could say the same thing today with the Bible. People actually literally believe the Bible, whereas a lot of people would be okay, no, there's teachings you can take from the Bible and take it literally. So did people believe
the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, and every other
I pick up Christianity because
text?
it's a simple one, but you can insert any religion here.
So in reality, I think people always are much more nuanced and complicated than we give them credit for, and the increasingly, I don't want to sound super nerdy, but it's almost monochromatic. It's look, the human piano, like a real piano, has 88 keys of emotional range. I almost said rage. Maybe that's better. We've got 88 keys, right? We've got a wide range of expression, and increasingly, we're being dominated by the middle four keys, and every song being written, not literally, I'm not talking about music. This is a metaphor, friends. Every song every political message, it's just banging away on the same four keys, and it's gotten stupid and annoying in its overly simplistic view. I think people are capable of much more than that, but they're not being fed it. And folks are busy. Life ain't easy. People got rent to pay, medicine to buy, kids to raise. That alone, I don't want to get on that, diversion here, but like that, I did not know how hard it was going to be a parent. Partly because I thought I was going to be better at it. I just assumed that I'm a pretty chill guy. I've been a lot of places. I've seen a lot of stuff. This is going to be fine. It's not fine. It's really hard. And it's even harder for people who don't have some of the social safety nets or family safety nets that have helped us when we've gone through some really rough spots. Oh, or just even the ability of somebody else in the family with a job to pick up a little bit of slack when, as has happened, we find out all of a sudden that, the landlord needs the house back and we got to move, right? And like for people who don't have the ability for someone else in the family to like, here, I'll spot you. You'll be okay. I know this will work out and, help you through the ruts, there, but for the grace of God, go I kind of a thing. And I try to be aware of that as much as I can. Like the studies are shocking. I didn't look them up in advance, but I've heard them relatively recently. The fact that most people in this country are like 3 days away from homelessness at some sort of economic level.
A high majority of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency.
There you go.
They have an average of like $500 in savings, which, I consider myself very lucky, and I work very hard. So I earn it as well, that I am not in that camp. But I easily could be within a few months. And that's terrifying.
Any of us could.
Any of us could, correct.
And not any of us, but like the majority, the vast
the 95% of us could.
Yeah.
I mean, there's 3 people who own more than the 50% of the world. That's just a fact.
It's crazy. This rock spinning through space in the middle of nowhere, and there's like 3 guys.
And there's 3 guys, right? And they're all in America, which is crazy. Yeah. And they could be in Saudi Arabia, but they could be lying about their wealth. We have no idea. But I do want to stick to the institution of media.
Let's do it.
People on the internet, people my generation say, we don't trust the institutions. We shouldn't trust the institutions. Well, I want to flip that. Do they trust us? And I think that's the bigger problem. We're not supposed to trust the institutions. If you trust government, man, if you're relying on government to save you, look around. It's not coming from anybody. But do the institutions trust us? And how can we get them to trust us? Because news media organizations, yes, it is beneficial for them financially to not tell us the truth and to stir anger and hate and all this stuff. But their higher-ups and people who feed them information, they don't trust us with the truth at all. So I think that's the bigger problem. That kind of goes unannounced and unaddressed. What do you think?
There's a really interesting book that was written back when I was just finishing up with grad school at Berkeley. The guy at the same kind of age as me was getting his PhD in the geography department. And we all were in awe because, first of all, he was this brilliant guy. He was a great writer. He was also an artist. And his PhD dissertation, he sold it to Penguin Random House as like a real book before he was even done with his degree. The book is called Blank Spots on a Map. And it asks the question, what can we know about secret government programs from the outside without breaking any laws, by understanding that even secret government programs occupy the same world we do, so they follow the same laws of physics, which means they exist in space, they reflect light, things of that nature. So the book at one level is a story about him piecing together what he can about secret pilot plane, test plane programs, Groom Lake and Tonopah Test Range and things of that nature, Area 51, all the way through to Keystone spy satellites and secret government programs in the budget and things. It's just really cool. It's just an interesting read. But his basic question is, how much secrecy should a democracy tolerate, right? Do the people need to know everything?
No.
Or because at some level we've accepted the claim that, listen, there's some things you can't know about, you shouldn't know about, right?
Right.
And I think he's asking a super interesting question. And as somebody who spent, almost a decade of my life bouncing around dangerous, faraway places, in and out of war zones and things of that nature, where both our military and the others were engaged in, sometimes nefarious activities and things, I think that's an interesting question to ask. How much are we collectively as human beings willing to tolerate secrecy as a way of organizing, as an organizing principle of government? I don't have a very good answer to this, and Trevor, who wrote that book, knows a lot more and has gone a lot deeper into that question. But I think, Will, you touch on the core issue. Really do. You nailed it.
Let me take a stab at that.
Yeah.
In terms of secrecy. So you gave speeches at the UN, right? The UN.
Well, I wrote it. I didn't end up delivering it. The person who was appropriate to do the speaking did the speaking.
Okay, so you wrote a speech for the UN. So it's like international law, right? There is international law that exists. It's just impossible to enforce. So in terms of secrets, as long as you are in the bounds of those international laws and you don't break those laws, you can keep your secrets. We don't need government, like nuclear codes, where they're held, certain things with the military, whatever, can be kept. But like lunch orders are top secret nowadays, whatever. But if they're breaking the law, it could be kept top secret, but it's also should be known, and there should be no punishment for if that's known. So secrecy should be within the bounds of international law, and when it comes to like war overseas.
Okay, now let me I think you're on your way to make an interesting point, but I want to throw a little wrinkle in.
Please.
So international law, as it is currently defined and enforced, is about the relationship between nation states. And it's a product of originally the League of Nations and then the United Nations compacts and so on, in which the signatories to these compacts are in fact governments. So here's where the real thing gets muddy, because international humanitarian law, which is about the rights between states, the relationship between states, maintains this principle of sovereignty at its heart, which is to say that the legitimate state government, and here they mean national government, right, has the right to act with impunity within its own territory. So now what do you do when, as in Sudan, where I spent a long period of time, the government itself, and I mean Sudan today is a perfect example of where this stuff breaks down, but I'm talking about 20 years ago, the government is funding paramilitary groups that are slaughtering civilians. So international law in that regard, sure, human rights law can kick in, but then we have the pragmatic reality of the Human Rights Council and of the UN Security Council, where you've got U.S., Britain, France, China, and Russia, and only one time in the history of the Security Council were they unanimous on something, which was the case of Iraq in 1990, which is entangled with my own story in a way. We won't get to it right this second. But that's the only time they ever agreed on something. They imposed sanctions on Iraq. So what do you do when governments are flaunting generally acceptable principles of how you should treat civilians, right? Like nobody thinks it's a good idea to be slaughtering women and children, right? However, this happens all the time, and it happens with impunity because it's happening inside the borders of a sovereign state. So there has been a movement for a good 20 years now called Responsibility to Protect, which is basically trying to rework some of the underlying principles and say, well, what if we could agree something that would keep that from happening? But that's sort of stuck. So your premise is not wrong. It's just the containers to which it's applied are nation states.
Well, let me take a stab at that too then.
Which brings a problem.
Yeah, let me take a stab at that too. So,
all right.
Example. Obama, Trump, and to some extent Bush killed countless of innocent people in Iraq, Afghanistan through drone strikes.
Well, this started earlier, so don't leave Clinton out. Don't leave Clinton out. By the way, and I would just I'll say why this is important. Why this is important is everybody blames Bush for this doctrine of regime change in Iraq. That was a Clinton administration doctrine. Madeleine Albright was the first one to ever use the phrase in a speech, and then Clinton made it the official policy of the Clinton administration in October of 1998 and started bombing Iraq in December of 98.
Let's even go back further to Vietnam, right? All the presidents since Eisenhower, right? So they broke international law. Now, should another state, another government, another country dictate over us? No, you can't do that. And you can't impose your will. But
that's the definition of sovereignty, and I think we have to ask ourselves whether we're willing to accept the price tag of that concept.
But the information needs to be released to the American public because it is being done in our name with our money, taxpayer money. So that information needs to be made public through a media so we can vote them out or convict them on our own. You can't rely, when it comes to international law, there is no power above them. They're technically, at least theoretically, all equal. Like, who are we to go into another country and be like, hey, you're breaking international law, we're going to punish you? No. You can't do that. The citizens of that democracy, or whatever nation state you have, need to be the one punishing the politicians and the military people because it's done in their name with sometimes their money, specifically in the U.S. So that is how it needs to be done, at least properly. Because
theoretically, you're not wrong.
In a perfect world, that's how I would.
But there's a couple other things. So, like, for example, if we were talking about societies with full-blown execution of democratic practices, then maybe a free press. Again, all these things, they line up really nicely on paper. Where a really free press is essential as a way of educating people in a political system where their vote can make a difference and change things. Like all that at the level of sort of theory and ideology, it's great, right? It's a little bit like saying, well, I think democracy is a good idea if it were to actually exist.
Correct.
So going back to something you said a minute ago, I don't want to leave off what you just said, but I want to bring in something you said a little bit ago. Do they trust us? Well, the answer is clearly no, because here would be the simple test. If you trusted the citizens to make decisions, then voting would be the easiest and most automatic thing on earth, right?
Yeah.
You would be able to vote anywhere at any time, just as you can file your taxes anywhere, anytime, online, whatever. The government has no problem knowing who I am in order to accept my income tax payments for myself and my S corp, right? And I can do that all online. Like, I don't have to see anybody. They're not checking my ID. I mean, they are, but in an electronic way, right? If we really cared about democracy, we would make it easy for every qualified adult person to vote, right? And I know there would be some debate about qualified, but we would have that debate, and then it would be done. Voter registration would be automatic.
Yep.
Election day would be a national holiday.
Yep.
Whatever. I don't know.
100%.
And you look at the amount of effort put into making that hard, rigging the rules, changing the district, like at every possible level, it's clear.
Not allowing debates
there's a threat.
for more political candidates.
There's a threat.
Yeah.
So, and I don't care, again, listeners, I don't care which party you vote for. This is not my point. It's not good for any of them. Right? Nobody, the corporate Democrats are just as bad as everybody else. This is not good. So we, the people, at some fundamental level, ought to be going, hey. Like, how is this okay? But again, this comes back to who has the time and the wherewithal, the actual economic means to get engaged in these issues, right? Well, not a lot of folks.
And to be fair, right, I do like picking on corporate media because it's easy. I like picking on politicians because they're assholes. But to be fair, if corporate media, if any media for that matter, did report, like on the genocide in Yemen, right, that Saudi Arabia is doing, or what happened in Afghanistan, or what's happening in Ukraine, if they're telling the truth about that, the full truth, I'm not saying they're lying completely, but the full truth, would the populace care? Or are they more interested in Bud Light having a trans person as their spokesperson for like a week? The populace because there is some responsibility on the public to seek out the information and see through the bullshit, which generally the public doesn't do.
Well, yes, and
you have
again,
responsibility as a citizen.
I agree that there is a strong responsibility, and this is why I think changing the way interests are aligned economically is required here. So I guess at some level that makes me an old-fashioned Marxist revolutionary, but I don't mean this in some sort of silly kind of, grad school seminar debate kind of way. I mean, we just got a system in which the interests are aligned with the powerful and the wealthy and not with everybody else, and that is causing a problem because how could somebody get interested in it? Like, practically, right? You got a single mom working 3 jobs, 4 kids at home, concerns about the neighborhood she lives in, concerns about the future of her kids, concerns about their lack of health care, concerns about their food, the school lunch programs getting challenged, and somebody's yelling about the bathrooms and like who's allowed to use what bathroom. And does she really care? No, she doesn't.
No.
And should she? Well, probably, but is that reasonable to expect? No, of course not. We've all got this kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing we need to be dealing with. I understand that, and I appreciate that. The corporate media and corporate politics they come at a big price. And I don't think it means the alternative is easy, right? We've seen that populism swings both ways. And, it's not like there's a ready-made obvious answer to this. I will say I've been convinced at some level by people who have argued that all politics is local.
Yes.
At the end of the day.
Yes.
And it's the gutting of local newsrooms and the lack of awareness that there are opportunities for people to make a direct difference in their own neighborhoods, school districts, communities, cities, and states. That whole layer of our political participation is pretty much unknown.
It's gone.
And that's where the rubber really meets the road.
Yeah. The most important vote isn't for presidents, for city council.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. City councils, school boards,
your mayor,
all of the ways in which you could get involved. Even, for people who live in the suburbs, your freaking HOA, right?
Yeah.
Get on the board of your HOA, just something. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for any of this, except to say that we've got a lot of toxic money, toxic masculinity, and a bunch of other toxic stuff running amok. The media is not helping. But at the same time, saying that, I believe it could. And so that's, I don't want to throw away the transformational potential of really great storytelling. It's just, we might be looking for it in the wrong place now. I think we may have to just accept the fact that game is over, right? The way in which advertising dollars could drive, channels, could drive, stories, etc., that informed people, I think that's gone. And we have to reinvent it. We have to do it together. And it's not going to be a single answer. It's going to be lots of different things. That's cool. I'm a pluralist. I want people trying all kinds of experiments and making all kinds of weird shit happen.
Yeah.
And
the answer is always going to have many flaws. Like, I'm a big proponent of independent media. Obviously, I'm a podcaster, right? I love podcasts. Yeah. I get most of my news from trusted sources on YouTube, and some of them I have to recognize their biases. Even though they won't, I will for them. But with independent news, also has problems because they don't have access, and they have their biases, and they can get audience captured. You can get corporate capture with, like, Pfizer's money feeding your audience in your pocketbooks. But if you get an audience and you piss off that audience, you're done as an independent content creator, independent news person. So there's plenty of flaws in independent media as well. I mean, you have a great mic there. You have an experience in radio. I'm assuming you've been on thousands of podcasts by now. Like, you probably run into this a bunch as well.
Well, so what's interesting is I have a somewhat contrarian, surprise, contrarian point of view about it. I think that we, listen, there's multiple ways to go. I'm going to be the last person to tell anybody what's right for them, right? I hope that's been made abundantly clear. But at the same time, I do have some concerns about the indies trying to play the same game as the big media outlets. But I'm not yet convinced of what I actually think about this. Let me try out a thought with you. So one thing I do know about podcasting, both as a strategist and as a podcast producer and, a guest and all the rest, the audience game is the hardest one of all. So what you just identified as the potential threat to independent media is correct. It's hard to grow an audience. It's hard to sustain an audience. And it's hard to monetize that audience, right? So in part, I have in my own professional practice as an advisor to professional services firms who want to use podcasting to grow their businesses, I've actually pivoted away from the audience first model because I know with these particular clients and this particular set of business goals, I can help them achieve those goals without having to grow a huge audience. We could talk about that. We don't have to.
No, please.
It doesn't matter.
Let's
for
do
most
that.
folks, well, I'll get into the details in a minute, but it requires having a service that's narrowly targeted, which usually means B2B, and it requires an industry that's driven primarily through relationships, and those relationships need to last because the lifetime value of a client or customer could easily run into the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So we're talking law firms, architecture firms, accountancies, et cetera. And I'm selfishly defining my service offerings and the people that I can help in order to avoid the audience growth problem. So speaking of biases, I will put that one right out on the table. But here's what I do observe from being adjacent to the rest. Making content that engages people in a meaningful way such that they will support you. And let's be clear, for podcasts or any other form of independent media, the only three ways you can make money with that, from the audience itself, is through ads, sponsorships, or premium subscriptions. If there's another one, I'm not aware of it. I'm happy to learn, but I think those are the three. So you can have a large enough audience that you can monetize it on a CPM basis, right, through ads. You can have either a large or a hyper niche and targeted audience that you can monetize through sponsorships. So somebody who wants to reach that group of people. I know folks that have a very, very monetarily successful show with only 1,000 downloads because it is a niche audience that a sponsor wants exclusive access to. So they just buy the whole inventory for the whole show, and they'll make $1,000 an episode, and that can be very meaningful, right? So ads, sponsorships, or premium subscriptions, the Patreon type model, the Substack type model in writing, things of that nature. So, but how do you make that kind of content? I mean, you're going to know the answer to this better than me, Will, because I'm not even playing that game. That is hard.
Well,
it's hard.
Seeing as that I don't do either of those three. But what I do is, and this is something that a few weeks ago, Keith Hayes, a friend of the show, grew up in my neck of the woods, and he's been podcasting since like 2006. Right? So people have been telling him forever, like, this is not going to work, this is not going to work. And he says something brilliant. You don't need a big audience. You don't need those three to be successful in podcasting. I am firsthand in that as well. Like, he just got a partnership with the VA, with one of the people he works for, because he also does production services. So one thing I would add to your list of 4 is services. Like, I consider my podcast a service, right? I am giving you a service. Yes, we are talking. It's free, but I am giving you all the content I create, all of the social media posts, like this copy from ChatGPT, as well as I'm going to fix it because it's ChatGPT. But like, I'm giving you a service, giving you all the content for you to use as well as for me to use. Will that help me get an audience? Hey, man, I hope so. But audience is my number one focus, because who is my audience? On YouTube, no idea. TikTok, not a clue. In real life, I can name you all of them, because those are the people who matter most to me. The people in real life, not my boss, not her boss. Her boss came up to me at work and was like, hey, Will, I heard you had a podcast with Alan. Like, send me a link. How'd that go? Oh, so I work, so my full-time job is a live stream producer. So she knows, now my boss's boss knows, who can determine if I get promoted or even go full-time with better benefits, knows I do a podcast. That is the value of my podcast, not the audience, not perfect. Advertisements.
Great. So this fits actually with this full model that I have, but it's not the audience itself. So
Correct.
What I have said, and there's a slide in my deck, but which is awesome.
Yeah.
No, but listen, it's literally the best, because I'll just pause for a second and say the people who are constrained by audience growth metrics, in many ways, are going to try to play a game in which they end up down the line. And ask any influencer who's been doing it a minute whether or not they're as happy with the content they make lately as they were when they started. And the answer is no. And you ask, well, why not? And they say, well, because I'm less myself. I've sort of had to do things that I know the audience would like. And now that I've got this audience and I'm making reasonable amount of money through these brand deals, I try other things, and like the engagement drops, and I'm like, oh man, so I'm trapped.
Yeah,
they're not literally trapped, but they can feel that
trapped.
way.
They are. They're emotionally and mentally and physically trapped.
Yeah. So I say that there's 3 untapped opportunities in podcasting, but I would apply this to all indie media, because I don't think there's anything, just like I don't think humans are the most significant and special species on the face of the earth, I don't think that podcasts are the most special and significant form of media. By the way, that just saying that pisses off a lot of self-appointed podcast experts.
I agree with you.
But I don't care.
Podcasting isn't there yet, but I agree with you.
But it doesn't matter. It's just, it'll be there, it'll never be there, and it could still be special, you know? So here's the 3 untapped opportunities, right? The first is relationships. That's the biggest one in my view.
Networking.
And that's what I'm doing for my clients with the shows we produce. And listening to your description, that's what you're doing.
Yeah,
so
I'm networking.
Your
Absolutely.
podcast is networking. Your podcast is relationship building. And even the consumption of it, oh, hey, I heard you had a podcast. I'm going to go listen to a couple episodes of it, is a relationship building phenomenon. That person may not subscribe and, pay you $5 a month through Patreon or some other nonsense.
I don't care.
Exactly. I don't care either. So that makes us align. So relationships is the first one. And there's a couple of ways that you can get those relationships. But I like the one that features on the guest, so that, I'm building shows for my clients that the podcast itself is a relationship engine. Mm-hmm. And I get the sense you're doing that same thing as well. Okay, so relationships. The second one is related but different, reputation. So I absolutely believe that podcasting, like many other forms of independent media, can be phenomenal for building a reputation. And this could involve hosting a show like you're doing, or it could involve guesting on shows like I'm doing right now. So reputation is about what? Getting known for who you are, your personality, your unique point of view, and your skills. So if I have a client who says, I really want a podcast to build my reputation, my first recommendation is not to start one, but to do a kind of a guest tour and actually develop some ways to share their thought leadership, which means you have to have thoughts first. Share your stories, share your strongly held opinions and point of views. This was like the first, 50 minutes of what we were doing, talking about, well, who's this guy? How does he see the world? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? I probably pissed a bunch of people off and they stopped listening. And some people are like, wow, that's really interesting. I don't know. We'll find out in 10 years, right?
Yes, we will.
The third one is reach. And I define this very, very differently. So reach is traditionally an old-fashioned mass media metric, which simply means the sheer number of people, right? Like downloads, unique listeners, those kind of metrics. I could care less about that. For myself and my clients, I want us to reach the right person. So it's actually more like relationships and reputation at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Targeted reach of the right listeners is an untapped asset. So circling back to where we were like 5 minutes ago, most indie creators who are in media in some form or another, I think, are trying to replicate the reach of big shows, right? They've got listener envy, download envy, right? And they think, well, if someday I had that many people listening to my show, I'd be able to make a lot of money through ads, have Athletic Greens sponsor my podcast or The Mattress or whatever the heck, right? So I don't know. I don't know that you have to play that game. Now, you can. Some people will make it.
Well, you don't. Here's
but
the
you
thing.
don't.
So I have the podcast acronym. Do you know what podcast stands for? If it was going to be an acronym.
Give it to me.
A podcast, this is Will Tarashuk original. I highly encourage you to use this. A podcast is a personally oriented discussion centered around select topics. Podcast. And the most important letter is P. Personal. It's personal. Or professional, right? If it's a business, it can be professional. The P is interchangeable.
I want my professionals to be more personal. So I'm with you. I would stick with personal because honestly, the mistake professionals make is they forget to be human.
Yes.
So I like your acronym the original way. I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah, I thought that. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sleep one night, and I was like, okay, I got to think of something. That's what I came up with. But
that's excellent.
It's on the topic of podcasting. I run a business. My business is podcasting, and my podcast is networking. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. What is my end goal? What do I want for this podcast? People. The final question of Talk My Tarashuk podcast, spoiler alert, always goes to the guest. So you get to ask me a question. And the most common question is, what do you want out of this? And it changes every single time. Because I've been thinking about this a lot. I have no idea. I'm kind of going through a little bit of a career transition right now, a little bit of like a mix-up of like where this podcast is and what it does. And I don't know. It kind of sounds like a good answer. Because at the end of the day, what do I really want in life? Well, my career comes second. I want to be a dad. That's it. That is the most important thing to me, and that comes across when I speak and how I interact and how I engage myself. I want to buy a house. I'm chasing the American dream. How I get there is just how I get there. So if this podcast is going to help me get there, that is what I want. If I can make a little bit of extra cash, use it as an emergency fund, that is what I want. If I can use it to make some cash under my sole proprietorship, start a 529 plan, my kid can go to college, that is what I want. So I want this podcast to reach 10 million views, make $100,000, sell it and sell equity and go public. No, fuck all that. That's nonsense. I like talking to people. I like networking with people. You are a very interesting person, and you kind of took me through the ringer psychologically in the beginning. I felt like a complete fucking amateur. So thank you for that. But that's how I learn, right? I got to Google some of the words you said, but that's fine. That's how I learn and become a better speaker. And it's the way you speak and engage yourself. It's like, okay, this is someone I would want to work with. I'm glad I can now add you to my network. Where is that going to go? I have no idea. And sometimes that's really terrifying.
Good news is, I was thinking recently, like I mentioned at one point, I was just at this week-long, series of, it was a conference, PHX Startup Week. We've been doing it here in Phoenix every year for 9 years. It's interesting, but I'm kind of adjacent to it. I'm not that interested in startups. I'm not that interested in VC funding. I could care less, right? Like you, I'm not trying to, build some unicorn in that way. It's not interesting to me. But I was thinking, why do I do this? Why do I go out and spend a week? My wife and I share a car. We have 2 kids who are homeschooled. So, for me to be away from the house for a week is a big toll on them and on, change. I'm away from my own business. I mean, kind of peripherally because I'm talking to people and stuff. I'm like, why do I do this? The answer is really quite simple. My own life experience and all the places I've been, all the countries I've lived and worked in, all the stuff in the bio at the very beginning has led me to believe one thing is true, which is you're always only one conversation away from things that you did not even realize were going to be fascinating to you, take over your life, take you in a new direction, maybe get you ultimately what you want, or maybe just get you one step closer. One conversation away. Now, the problem is you don't know what that conversation is or who you have to have it with. So you should talk to everybody. I firmly believe that. So when I was teaching at Berkeley, I used to tell my students, listen, everything that I ended up doing that you now think is really cool. I was a reporter for Newsweek during the invasion of Iraq. I went to work for a humanitarian relief organization, helped make the crisis in Darfur one of the biggest news stories of 2004. All this media stuff, all this, whatever, like getting these strange jobs in strange places that led, to a relationship that, was wonderful for the 2 years that it lasted, like stuff that just never... It all started because I was talking with somebody and an opportunity appeared in the conversation and I said yes to something that was probably a bad idea at the time. But when you say yes to things that, weren't on the plan and they take you in directions you didn't expect. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just my personality is well suited for that. But I've found the detours are always more interesting than the well-paved highway. And you never know what's going to happen when you talk to people and when you're open. So back to what we were talking about curiosity. I'll take curiosity over, dogmatism any day because one is open and leads to things you didn't know were possible, and the other is closed and insists on what you already think is true.
Yeah.
It's obvious which one I prefer.
And to be honest, the money I've made through this podcast was kind of on accident.
Right.
Yeah, it's just kind of how it is. Someone's like, hey, can you do this? I'm interested in this. I'm like, oh, yes, I can. I have a business model. Cool. Great. But it's like, I want my business to be local. I want it to be friend of a friend. I want to use my network and leverage my network. Like, I don't want a website ever. I don't think I need one for this podcast in particular, for Willie T Productions and Talking with Tarashuk. I don't think I need one. I put this post on LinkedIn. You were the only one who responded, so thank you.
You're very welcome.
My old boss, so not my boss, it was my boss's boss's boss, who then reported that other boss who started the podcast. He heard the podcast with his old colleague who left the company. He left the company. He's like, hey, can I come on? Great. Adam, I was like, cool. You want to come on? Let's come on. And then he recommended me as someone who's looking for podcasting. So great. There is a lead. So that's kind of how I want to build my business, just through personal connections, people I know. Hey, man, I know a guy. And I can go, great, I can do this. I also know a guy. So like, if I'm busy, this podcast takes up a lot of my time, plus my full-time job. I know people in my own life who are audio editors. Or if like I ask like you, hey, Adrian, do you know an audio editor? Can you edit audio? What's your price? I'll pay you. And just get a job and just outsource to people I trust. So I want to build my business really on trust in people I know and keep it in my network. And I think it doesn't need to be $1 million a year. It can just be like $5,000 a month in revenue that I can keep for myself and pay people others. That's cool. I'm 28 years old. I don't need that much.
Yeah, this is a great outlook. It's absolutely great. I think, we get in too much of a hurry And I see this. I don't think school helps. As kids are supposed to learn stuff earlier and earlier, and parents get more and more stressed. Johnny started kindergarten next month, and he hasn't learned Latin yet. I mean, that's not real, but it basically tells you what people are. It's very much like what people are grappling with. I think we need to relax, because here's the thing: life is either really long or it's not. Either way, you don't have much of a say in how it goes. So you might as well make the time meaningful. Might as well make the relationships last to the degree that they can. You might as well make your connections be real, because the truth of the matter is we got like 8 billion people, and give or take some change,
counting,
on this planet who are so afraid, not all of them, but a lot of them are afraid of getting found out for the exact same thing that everybody else is afraid of getting found out for, which is that, you don't always know what you're doing. You make a bunch of mistakes. Sometimes you're an asshole. Actually, it's true. That I love Reddit. Am I the asshole? And the answer is probably half the time, right?
So
half the time.
So this is quick sidebar. My friend and I, we also do a wrestling podcast. We're live every Wednesday, King's Rings podcast. And on our post show, for the past few weeks, we've been playing Am I the Asshole on Reddit. And it's fascinating. Like, that's right up your alley. It's very much philosophical and like a case study of society.
Stuff.
It's great. Yeah. It's great. I don't want to make it a segment, to be honest. Am I the asshole?
No, it's perfect. So I think we all got to lighten up a little bit. None of us are really all that special, which is why we should be kind to everybody, because you never know when you're going to need it. But it's not, I don't mean it in a calculating way. Like, it's not like putting karma pennies in the bank, because then you're going to, it's just, you never know. Like, how many times do you have to hear stories about how somebody, was either really rude to someone and then later found out that they shouldn't have been, or found out they were really nice to someone and later was like, oh, that's the president of the bank and that's why you got hired. Just be cool to everybody. What's your problem? Will you lighten up? We're all having a hard time out here. Nobody's got it easy, because humaning is hard.
And no one knows what they're doing.
And so say yes to stuff that you don't know how it's going to turn out. Take a risk. The best sort of risk mitigation strategy is to be kind. It's why humanitarian relief organizations around the world have stickers on their vehicles that have an AK-47 with a red circle and a line through it, because they're trying to tell people we're not playing the game that everyone else in this war zone is playing. Now, that doesn't protect us the way that it used to. Tragically, I've lost a lot of friends to violence against aid workers in Afghanistan, Iraq, the occupied Palestinian territories, Sudan, other places. Buddy of mine, we were each going to lead a mission in Sudan, and he decided to take this one, and I took the other one, and his ran over a landmine that had been in the ground for 20 years from an old civil war. He incinerated to death in his car. I survived. You just never know what's going to happen wherever you are, right? The piano might fall out of space and land on my house right now. I don't know. So I can't live like that's something I can worry about. You can't control the uncontrollable. You can only control what you can control. And I say first thing you can control is how you treat other people. But you can't be nice to other people till you're nice to yourself. So lighten up a little bit. You're not that bad, all right? You've done some dumb stuff. You might have hurt some people. You might have things that you need to make right. Just do that. And then get on with it. Don't do that again. Be good. We can do better.
Just take it
I don't know why this turned into like a little preacher thing, but
no, I needed it.
You can do better.
I'm not gonna lie,
and everybody else. You can do better. We all can.
I really needed it. I was feeling very down today, because
Were
it's
you?
kind of like, I'm in a crossroads a little bit. Like, I don't know what to do. Like with the podcast, with the business, I'm not going to stop doing the podcast. This is fun for me, right? This is my therapy. This is what I do. What I do is podcasting, but it's like how I kind of mold it in what I'm doing and what the plan is moving forward. I'm a little bit of a brick wall. I'm a little stuck. But this conversation, it's like I feel a lot better. Just to get some shit off my chest. And I genuinely feel a lot better. And
I'm very happy
I have a
for
little
that.
bit more of a plan. But please, you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so you said you wanted to be local.
Yes.
And in my point of view, that's the easiest thing. I mean, nothing's easy, but that's a great place to start. Because here's the good news. If you want to do something local, there's a almost limitless number of people who would love the opportunity to tell their story, talk about their business, share a little about their community and what they're doing, and just have real conversations. Because you have a studio, it's a very easy thing to, if you can have people over. I don't know if this is at your house or a place that people can come to.
This is technically my office, but I'm in New Jersey. If anyone's local to New Jersey, I do have a studio in Montclair.
Well, there you go. So you can say, listen, I have a show called X. If we feature people from the local community, they could be business leaders, they could be corporate executives, they could be, mom and pop stores, they could be just people. It doesn't really matter. Again, depends on if there's a quote unquote business strategy or not, but all of it works. And then you just have a show where you have a kind of an umbrella for shows. And then you don't have to be stuck with something. So if you had a network, and I'm putting air quotes if you're listening, if you had a network, which literally is just an umbrella for all the other stuff you want to do, and then you just do miniseries, right? So you don't have to do a weekly show that goes on forever. You can say, I'm going to do 6 episodes about candy stores. I'm going to do, 3 episodes about, whatever, the water board, like whatever interests you. Then you reach out to people, and I've done this 400 times. The response rate's 100% yes. The only issue was ever, I'm not available that week. Could we do it another week? So 400 guests I invited on one of my podcasts, which I'm not currently doing, but I did from the end of 2018 to the end of about 2021. It got harder to do when it went remote because the magic of not being in the room with people was part of what really makes this work.
It's hard to recreate, but I think we're on a wavelength. It's fine.
Well, we are, but also, you and I we do this. So like for me to sit here looking into this little piece of glass and talking to you like we're in the same room. I've done this for almost 10
years. Yeah,
done this once or twice.
Yeah, I've done this a few times.
So, and it's easy for me to actually create the experience of being with you, which makes it easy for you to be with me because you're also skilled at this too. So, but when you could be in a room with somebody, it is more interesting. It doesn't even mean it's going to be easier. Like they're going to be nervous. They're going to be sweating because they don't do this a lot. Like you're the first person whose podcast they've been on potentially. Yeah. But that could be really cool. So you create the framework of, hey, I'm doing a mini series on this topic. I think you'd be a great person. Would you be interested in being a guest on my show? And it's 45 minutes away. It's 20 minutes away. Whatever it is, people will drive to you when the show concept is about them. So the show that I'm talking about here is 100%. One that I did. It was just called Valley Business Radio. It's very generic, but I could interview anybody that I wanted, and they all said yes. So you could get way more niche, and I really like, this is something I've gotten onto lately for myself and my clients. We don't do the never-ending podcast every week. Because look, for those of you who know, and Will, you know this like nobody's business, there's like 5 phases: planning, production, post-production, publication, and promotion. Yes. And the biggest mistake people make is they try to do all 5 of those things for every single episode over and over and over again. It becomes a hamster wheel
that's what I do.
Of hell.
Yeah.
Right?
It's fun,
so I say,
though.
great.
I like
plan a season. Plan a mini series. Mm-hmm. Then you just plan once, take a couple of weeks, come up with a concept, plan for it, invite people, get it scheduled. Record all the episodes in 2 days, 3 days, right? Doesn't take a long time.
Yeah.
Batch it. Then, take as much time as you need with your day job to post-produce, and even just to get the main episodes ready, because then you can work on the clips, on an ongoing basis. Then publish the whole thing all at once, like Netflix. Thanks so much for being a guest on my podcast. Season 5 of 5 episodes or 8 episodes or whatever is now out, or our mini series on, local moms in business is also out. And you could, I'm not trying to change what you're doing, but I know the local angle very well.
It plays into what I do. Because, like, talking with Tarashuk, I talk to everybody. Like, you are who you are. Next week, it's a podcast expert. The week after that, it's a political TikToker, right? It's all over the place. It's all. Yeah. And last week, it was me and my friend is hanging out. But niches are huge. I'm like, cool. I like everything. I'm curious. I'm interested in a lot of different things. Let me create niches. So it's talking with Tarashuk isn't necessarily a network, but it creates niches. So, for example, I have the main feed, everything I do, the full shows and the clips. I have a second feed, just the clips. I have a third feed, just the full shows. Every Wednesday, and like it is kind of in batches, but I'm in a rhythm. I'm in a production rhythm of how I do things. It just works for me. I love it. But everything Wednesday morning, the podcast, the clips are released at 8 a.m. The podcast is at 8:30. So the first thing you see is the podcast, then the clips, podcast, and all the clips. But I go to take it a step further. So this particular podcast is going to be on the All Talk to Tarashuk. The full show is just a full show. The clips, all the clips. But it's also going to be on some of the clips are going to be on the Entrepreneurs feed. So it's a podcast playlist, a feed. So it's on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, and all that, where I speak to entrepreneurs, or if we give advice to entrepreneurs, the feed is directed specifically towards entrepreneurs, a niche audience. Or if we talked about sports, we talk about baseball, I'd throw it on there. If we talk about the economy, I'll throw it on there, the money playlist. Podcast. This last half of the podcast, we're talking all about podcasting. The clips from the specific about podcasting are going to be on that feed. So it's very niched, and it does come out in batches. So like the sports hasn't come out in a few weeks. That's fine. I haven't talked about sports in a few weeks. That's cool. That's fine with me. So I do kind of create those niches, and I get a sense of, okay, what are people liking and clicking on?
Yeah, I think you could do it both ways. I think you could do it the way you described, where you have essentially one pillar and then multiple feeds.
Yeah.
I like the one where you have one feed and then you just put multiple things on it. Because honestly, think these days, the idea, especially if you're not playing the game where your audience has to grow from episode to episode to episode to episode, think about how you consume stuff. I'm jumping into the feed saying like, I want to listen to this one, not that one, not that one, not one, this one. And I'm fine. It doesn't bother me. I never think, why did this podcaster put all these different guests in the same show? This should have been 6 shows. I just skip the ones I'm not interested in, listen to the ones that I am interested in. If I like it enough, I might subscribe, and then I'll keep doing the same thing. Skip the ones I'm not interested in, listen to the ones. So I think that we don't always realize the power of having audiences at the episode level rather than audiences at the show level. Like everyone's talking about growing the audience at the show level, and that's totally fine if that's how you want to monetize, like we talked about earlier. But if you're not trying to do that, then you actually have more flexibility. And so with Valley Business Radio, for example, Valley meaning the greater Phoenix metropolitan area, the Valley of the Sun. Everybody here just calls it the Valley.
The Valley.
So there's like 16 cities and a bunch of things, but it's the Valley. So Valley Business Radio would have a different audience for every episode depending on who was on. And I'm completely okay with that. I'm not trying to carry them over from one episode to the next. I mean, you just have to approach it differently, but you can also not, and it's okay.
Well, I like giving the audience choices. I'm big on choice. So if I typed in talking with Tarashuk, I'd be like, oh, yuck, he's speaking to another, political guy. Screw this. I like the baseball talks. I like the wrestling talk. I'm just subscribe to the sports one. I mean, it's just like if you like all of it, subscribe to all of it. And it's a way so I can kind of gauge my audience as it grows. I do think I'm thinking about it now. I probably should have done it after I have the audience. They could split them up after you have them, not necessarily before you have them. But I'm thinking about keeping it down just to 3 clips, main, and all of them.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, because then at least there is consistency at the level of the format. So if you're really interested in clips and that's how you want to consume, great, you got that, etc. But, going back to something you asked near the beginning of this, Will, which is, do they give us enough credit or do they trust us, I think was your actual question. And think about how we've always consumed media. Like the newspaper had a bunch of stuff in it that not everybody read. But
true.
There's always that one guy who's like, your grandpa who would like read it from cover to cover, every single, But there's other people that like this section, like that section, read this part, or they like one reporter, so they only read his stories or her stories. They do that thing. Same thing with network TV. If you didn't watch it 24 hours a day, you had, even in the era of appointment consumption, you like for me as a kid, it was like Magnum PI was on at like 3 and then, or 4. A-Team was at 2. Anyway, I don't remember, but it's like A-Team. It was like A-Team, Magnum PI, Knight Rider, and I just watched. I didn't care about anything else. I wasn't watching in the evening, partly because I wasn't supposed to be watching at all. So once my parents, were like coming home, I'm Gen X, so like we were left alone forever, basically. So I would watch the shows in the mid of the afternoon when I could get away with it, and then turn the TV off and pretend I've been doing my homework all day. So we've always been selective. It's okay. Trust them. They'll figure it out.
I think that's a good point. I think that's a great point. All right. Well, Adrian, we've been going about an hour and 20 minutes, and I do want to thank you, but I'm getting hungry. It is time to go. But before we do, I did tease a little bit. The final question of Talking with Tarashuk podcast always goes to the guest. It's a nice little twist like the turn. And if anyone listens to the podcast before, they know it's coming. So please, I hope you are prepared. Anything you want to ask me, if you got nothing, you can plead the fifth.
Okay, very good. So I do want to ask you something, and I appreciate that you gave me the heads up because it allowed me to think of something while we were talking. But this is a question that I've started to realize I want to ask more people, and that is this. We often tell stories about our own lives as if we made a mistake, learned our lesson, and then everything after that was like a success graph going up and to the right. Like we never made the same mistake again. I personally have never learned anything except the hard way. And I have made the same mistake over and over and over and over for an embarrassingly long period of time. So here's my question, Will Tarashuk. What's a mistake that you kept making over and over and over and over?
Oh, God. Oh, man. That is a phenomenal question. Man, you got to get me right to the core here. Let me go on a solo shot while I think about this. So the immediate one I go to is emotionally. You know, I would let my emotions and my anxiety get the best of me. And I would make that mistake over and over and over and over again, whether it was with schoolwork, whether it was with my relationship with my friends, whether it was like going into college. Like, it got to the point where in high school I was just broken. You know, I was just broken, back at zero, had to build myself back up. And then I actually found it through podcasting. I built myself back up through podcasting and through my fraternity. The same week I started them both at the same time. And it was just, it completely changed my life. But how I learned from that mistake, you know, I still get emotional. I still just like, my girlfriend asks me all the time, like, what are you thinking? I'm just like, nothing. I'm just letting them pass through. I just let my thoughts pass through. So when it comes to your emotions and your thoughts, you just got to accept them. Feel what you're feeling, acknowledge it, accept it, and move on. That was a mistake I kept making over and over again. I would get lost in my feelings. I get lost in my thoughts. I get lost in my emotions, and I get stuck in a loop. And that would affect myself. It would affect my work. It would affect my schoolwork. It affected my relationships. And it got to the point where, yeah, there's going to be days where I'm upset, and I'm visibly upset, and you're going to feel me upset. And there's just nothing I can do about it. I'm not going to be a bitch to you. I'm not going to like ruin. I'm still going to come in and do my job and do what I have to do. And like, I'll cheer up, but on the inside, I'm still struggling. But it is what it is. Your emotions, you can't control your emotions. They're just there. If you're angry for a reason. Now, but what you can control is how you react to those emotions and how you respond to those emotions. But just feeling them is okay. And just acknowledge it. I am upset right now. I am mad right now. This deal fell through. It sucks. I'm upset. Acknowledge it. I accept it. What's the plan moving forward? And that's a mistake on a human level. That's not even on a professional level. That's a mistake that everyone consistently makes. And it's something that you're going to be learning with and figuring it out until the day you're dead.
That's an amazing answer. And I just want to thank you for your honesty and your openness. But I want to tell you the punchline of this. I think that the mistakes we make over and over and over are because we have strengths that we haven't recognized as strengths. So I'm willing to bet that if you think about this, your sensitivity, your ability to be moved by things emotionally is probably a strength that you may not have realized you had.
Oh, it's my gut.
And of course, it takes
my
the
gut
form.
is always right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. And that's my hunch. I don't know, but I'm going to keep talking to people about it and see how it goes. I think the mistakes we make over and over and over are because there's a strength we're trying to use. We just haven't learned how yet.
Yeah. I think that's phenomenal. I think that's spot on. And podcasting helped me realize that strength.
Love that.
So even if my YouTube stays under 1,000 subscribers forever, that's fine. At the end of the day, that's fine. If it helps me get a full-time job with way better health benefits and more PTO, and I can afford that house and the kids, that's cool. That's cool. And that's my goal with this podcast, and that's the goal with Willie T Productions. And this podcast, everything I do for this podcast, including the hosting, including the recording, including the distribution, including the social media, including all the clips, everything I do is a service. My podcast is a service, and the more I podcast, the more I develop and build those services, the more I network, the more people reach out to me saying, hey, can you do this? You know someone who can do this. And it's very local. It's very local. I don't need bells and whistles. My overhead is about maybe $100 a month. I got about $300 a month coming in. So to me, that's a success. So Adrian, thank you again very much
welcome.
for being a guest on this podcast. Anything you want to share, plug, where people can find you? My friends, this has been phenomenal. The floor is yours.
Thanks. No, I mean, I'm just up to so many things. There's not any one thing I want people to do. I mean, you can find me anywhere that you can Google Adrian McIntyre. And my call to you would be to just the same thing as we were just talking about with Will. Think about yourself with a little bit of kindness, a little bit of compassion. Maybe those mistakes you keep making aren't your fault. There's a strength there you haven't learned how to use yet. And maybe you've been told it's not okay. I promise you it's okay. You're okay. And thanks for having me.
Of course. Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Will Tarashuk. T as in Thomas, A-R-A-S-H-U-K. If you support my work and want to support the Talker and Tarashuk podcast, down there in the description below. This is what I hate doing the most, but I do it because I have to, not because I want to. There is a GoFundMe tab. Just throw me $5 and help support the podcast. Adrian, I'll drop you a link as well, my follow-up email. If you can, great. If not, I won't hold it against you. Anything else? YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube. TikTok is fun. Instagram is whatever. All my stuff is in the link tree in the description, also down below. Next week, I will be talking with Ryan Sullivan. As my camera goes out of focus, there I am. I'm talking with Ryan Sullivan, a Jersey Boy podcast. So I spoke to him on the podcast in 2020. On a different podcast, we're going to speak about his business, the podcast institution, what we think. I'm asking for some business advice as I go through his transition, kind of figure out what the fuck I'm trying to do. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait to have Ryan back on the podcast. He's a phenomenal podcast Principles is a phenomenal platform. Anyone on LinkedIn, follow him. He is incredible. But I'll be back next week. Until then, y'all take care.